How did I come up with these ideas? Is I was kind of a little bit of a normie libertarian kind of person. And I started reading a little bit and I started thinking a little bit. And after a little while, I'd had a little too much to think. And I think that, the way you come up with these ideas is you're sort of you ever seen the movie The Truman Show?
Of course.
You watch The Truman Show. It's really, really great movie. And, Truman, just starts to notice these things about the world he lives in that just aren't real. They can't possibly be real. The sky, the horizon is kind of stitched together. I'll give you an example of one of these things that's very, very simple, which is that you have these two words, politics and democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And you might notice that analytically, these words mean the same thing.
Do they?
Well, what is democracy without politics? It sounds like something they might have in North Korea. Actually, the full name of North Korea is the DPRK. That's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That is 3 euphemisms for democracy, 1 place name, and it's a monarchy. And so, this is one of the things that we sort of see across history is that basically regimes, they tend to lie. They tend to actually sort of, conceal the most basic things about what they are. Let's go, for example, to the United Kingdom. It's not a kingdom. No one could possibly describe it objectively as a kingdom. It's true that it has a king, but the idea that the king is running the government is preposterous. Okay, and everyone in the UK recognizes that the idea that the king is running the government is preposterous. It wasn't really true, let's say, in 1725 that the king was running the government. That would be, I guess, George I. But people really believed it was the case then. And so you have these, when we call the U.S. a democracy, it's actually much more similar to calling the United Kingdom a kingdom than we might think. One of the ways that you can see this is, again, if you look at these words, democracy and politics, you'll hear that they have opposite valences. So democracy, anything democratic is good. We're going to democratize U.S. foreign policy. I don't know what it means, but it has to be good. We're going to politicize U.S. foreign policy. Clearly bad. Like, we don't want this to be political. The word political has acquired a negative valence. We're going to put politicians in charge of the government. Politicians. Nobody likes politicians. How should they be in charge of the government? And then you're just like, wait, but isn't having politicians in charge of the government what we mean when we say democracy? Moreover, when we look at actually the way that Washington, D.C. works, I actually grew up, my father was in the U.S. Foreign Service in the State Department. So you grow up in the State Department and they have very much this attitude of like politics is this like dirty thing that needs to be kept out of government whenever possible, right? It's like you're sort of clearly seeing, okay, we have to kind of pretend to be this, but if you actually look at the way that U.S. foreign policy changes when you have a presidential election, we'll get to Congress later, but until Donald Trump's really second term, actually the influence of the election on foreign policy is pretty minimal, and the influence of the presidential election on domestic policy is almost zero because domestic policy is run by Congress. And so, we have these situations where everyone goes out in this election and they really think that they're like, they talk as if they were electing a king. They say Donald Trump is in power. He's certainly not a negligible, force in Washington. In fact, I'd say, one way to look at the sort of the paradox of the Trump administration is to say, well, I think it's pretty unquestionable that the second Trump administration had maybe 10 times as much impact on Washington as the
There's
first
no
Trump.
question. It's not
No
even
question.
close. Second, it sounds
10
like it's been 3 terms in one.
It could be
in
this.
12 months.
Could be 10 times as much. Could
Yeah.
be 20
Why do
times
you
as
think
much.
that is?
And if you look at, well, wait a second. There's a punchline. So if you look at if you compare the first Trump administration to the Bush administration, again, it's not as much of a difference, but it's 3x, 5x, as much of an impact. I mean,
Trump to Bush.
Bush to Trump. Yeah. If you remember the first Trump administration, it's like the liberals are like, the sky is falling every day.
Sure.
Right. And now they're like, the sky is falling every day. Right.
But are you saying him to Bush, he got 3 times more done, or Bush to Trump, Bush got 3 times more done?
No, but Trump, even the first term, Trump had 3 times as much impact as Bush. So the thing is, what you're seeing from the perspective of the New York Times reader, you're just like, oh my God, this politician, this, carnival barker has this immense power over the government, which is the most important thing around, and we're all going to die. And it's like, well, even, let's acknowledge that these enormous increases in power are true. Okay. But, power is something that you can measure on a 0 to 1 scale. 0 is you have no power, you don't matter. 1 is absolute power. So if you're looking at anything that's measurable on a 0 to 1 scale, does she love me? Does she love me not? One way to look at that is to say, all right, let me forget about where I am on this scale relatively and figure out where I am on the scale absolutely. Because actually, when you're seeing those kinds of increases, when you're seeing increases by an order of magnitude, for example, what you see is that those kinds of increases are most available at the bottom of the absolute spectrum. So when you're going
meaning closer to 0, not closer to 1.
Closer to 0, not closer to 1. If you can multiply anything by 100 and it's still less than 1, it's got to be a very small number. And so what people don't really realize about the post-1945 American political system is that it goes from, of course, in 1945, FDR dies. FDR is pretty close to 1. He's pretty close to really having absolute power over the government, especially in wartime, but also before wartime. He's really running the government like a CEO. And if you look at, there's a diary I have of one of his cabinet secretaries, and you look at FDR's cabinet meetings, they're like a CEO running a C-suite meeting. Okay, if you look at one of Trump's cabinet meetings, it's not like that. No, it's really not like that, because actually the government, the way that Washington today works is when you're a CEO of a company, I actually am a CEO of a company, when you're the CEO of a company, one of the sort of worst terms of you're not a good CEO is to say that you're reactive.
Okay.
You're always reacting to things that happen. You're not making proactive decisions. You're not sort of steering. You're basically reacting to your inbound.
Sure.
Company's doing really well and doesn't really need a CEO. Maybe it's fine to have a reactive CEO. Okay. But FDR was a proactive CEO. He could say, oh, we're going to build, look at Route 1, for example, on the California coast. That's an FDR project. That's a New Deal, I believe, California Conservation Corps project. Imagine building Route 1 today. Completely unimaginably impossible. It would be much harder than building the high-speed rail. Right. And so what you're seeing is this state which is almost entirely based on bureaucratic process. And when you're working in a process-based regime, everything is procedural, you're almost, as a civil servant, you're almost something like a judge in a way, because everything you're doing is following a process.
But FDR needed a crisis. Without that, he wouldn't have the power that he had, right?
I mean,
take the crisis out.
The way that FDR gains this power is very specific to the 1930s. And so, for example, one of the things you'll see in 1932, when FDR is running in the election, the Democratic Party is, of course, America's traditional conservative party at this time. And it's been basically taken over from the inside by radical progressives. The first example of this is Woodrow Wilson. FDR comes back again with the same thing, but he's still running as a Democrat. And so if you look at the 1932 political platform of Roosevelt, it's a traditional Democratic platform, which means small government, less spending, hard money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on this platform, he gets the votes of, the Solid South and the inner city Catholics, which basically drive him, into office. Be that as it may, America in 1932 is such a different country from today.
Night and day.
More different from any country today on earth, right? But he managed to do that. He basically managed to create the New Deal. He created the Washington that we have today. And so, one of the things, if you step back and look at U.S. history over the last 250 years, what you see is actually you're seeing transitions between forms of government. You know how the French talk about the First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic. So in American history, we have three administrations that basically establish a regime. We have the Washington administration, which is actually run by Hamilton. We have the Lincoln administration, and we have the FDR's administration. These things happen about every 75 or 80 years. They basically involve consolidation of the power of the federal government under a single individual. They basically, who is essentially a CEO of the government. This is what Hamilton and Washington were doing. This is what Lincoln was doing. This is what FDR is doing. Love them or hate them, it's a neutral thing. They did plenty of good and bad things both. That's what creates an administration. If you look at, being a California person, if you look at the New Deal, again, I think they did plenty of things wrong. I think they made plenty of terrible choices. They were also run like a startup. And so if you're looking for like a startup Washington, basically look at the New Deal. If you look, for example, at the Manhattan Project, libertarians will basically be like, oh, well, the government can't do anything efficiently. Well, the Manhattan Project is, number one, a government project. Number two, it is probably the most successful engineering project in history. Number three, it is run almost exactly like a California startup, right down to the two co-founders, right? You have the technical guy and the non-technical guy, if you've seen Oppenheimer. And number four, they're all communists, if you've seen Oppenheimer.
Of course.
Right, and so, that's not... That combination of facts doesn't really fit into any kind of legendarium of the American
But what's the point you're
world.
making? Your point you're making is
The point
run it like a startup, run it like a CEO, run it like a guy who's running a Fortune 100 company. Let him make the decisions. A lot of executive orders. I don't need to get everyone's permission to do something.
So if you look at, I'm sort of trying to set the historical stage a little bit for where we are. So if you look at, again, FDR creates this sort of really, he literally conquers the world, right? And he creates this kind of world-conquering state, and people just looked at America at that time, whether they were Americans or foreigners, they're just like, this is a country, this is a government that could do anything. So FDR dies in 45, and in 44, he picks Harry Truman as his VP. Harry Truman is kind of a nobody. He's not even really a New Dealer. He's a man of sort of limited pretensions and limited abilities. And FDR replaces Henry Wallace, who was kind of a hardcore communist, on his VP suite with Truman, knowing, FDR knows, nobody else knows. Americans did not even know that FDR used a wheelchair. You're aware of that, right? Like that's the level of like distance between reality and story that was totally routine back then, right? And people lived almost entirely in this comic book world. So, and on all sides, that war was fought in a comic book world. And World War I is even more sort of comic books. So you have basically a world where you have this very simplistic drama that's presented to a very unsophisticated, by today's standards, audience, right? So they just see this sort of propaganda experience of the war. They have no idea that FDR is dying. They have no idea of the difference between FDR and Truman. Actually, what happens is that because Truman is a lightweight, And he does not take over the job of FDR. He is not really in charge. This is what FDR intended. FDR is like, I've assembled this amazing collection of just amazing, talented, first-rate people who can do anything. And I'm not going to have a successor. Instead, power is going to flow down into the regime, into the administration, into what we now call the deep state, and there's going to be no way to get it out. What FDR didn't understand really, or maybe understood but didn't care, who knows, was that a regime like that has no way, simply because you have this administration that is almost impossible to get rid of, there's no sort of Darwinian constraint on its performance, especially if it's ruling the world and doesn't have to worry about Canada invading or something like that. And so the effectiveness of this organization has just been getting worse and worse and worse for the last 80 years. Hi there, I'm Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, and I've created a profile on this fascinating site, Manect, which allows anyone to put in a few dimes and ask me about anything, and I'll take questions on anything that isn't personal. I have many opinions on history, politics, science, economics, and all kinds of interesting things. And if you have a good and interesting question, why not ask it? I might well answer it. Thank you very much.